Hello, everybody. We're just going to give things another 30 seconds or so before we get underway. Enjoy the calming sound of birds.
Nice. You do get a lot of nice birds in my neighborhood.
Nice.
Even living in a city, I'm by Rock Creek Park, and so we get owls, we get hawks, and an occasional eagle.
That's fun.
Yep, pretty good for a city.
All right, so why don't we get underway? We appreciate everybody joining us today. My name is Jim McGlynn. I'm with Public Consulting Group. I'm a manager within our education practice area. And just in case you're wandering through cyberspace, you want to know you're in the right spot. This session today is really, over the next hour or so, we're hoping to sort of unpack the ESSER stimulus funds, some of the emerging trends that we're starting to see there across the country, and really through the lens of special education, and in particular, a shift towards greater effectiveness in the way in which we're structuring and delivering special education across the country. Our agenda for today is pretty simple. We're going to do some quick introductions. We've got our friend David DeSchrijver with us today, who's going to unpack some of the ESSER funds, give a little bit of context and some things from the vantage point of whiteboard advisors. Then we're going to just touch a little bit upon some of the things that we're seeing and some of the areas of focus that people are looking at in terms of key levers that as school districts and as states, we could be thinking about in terms of really making some change and innovation and really transforming special education and the outcomes for students. And then we want to create an opportunity for there to be some Q&A. I'll give this sort of note now and we'll remind you later. There is a Q&A function that's different than the chat. When it is time for Q&A, we'd appreciate it if people put their questions in there. David, do you mind introducing yourself?
Hello, everyone. David DeSchrijver, Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors. I usually position myself as an recovering education attorney. So I spent years working with states and districts on financial and policy and programmatic compliance issues, being clear about how to protect and be good stewards of federal and state and local dollars. And before that, Jim, I did a lot of education technology work in kind of turn of the century. Not only did I work on the Y2K bug, but related to data-driven decision-making and kind of the early days of building the architectures to support innovative solutions around the convergence of education and technology.
That's great. And I'd just like to thank you and your team from Whiteboard Advisors just for all the great, rich information they've been providing, not just PCG as one of your partners, but a lot of the states and districts that you work with. I also want to, give some thanks to the Urban Collaborative. I'm not sure if Dr. Lauren Katzman's out there somewhere, but she'll probably listen to this later. She's not. Lauren, I miss you deeply. We spent some time working together in Newark Public Schools, and we know you're off to other things, but we certainly miss you in the work day to day. Just very quickly around Public Consulting Group, PCG is a mission-driven company. We work exclusively with public sector agencies and nonprofit groups at the federal, state, and local level. We're structured in a way where we've got these focused domains of education, health, and human services. I actually work in our education practice area. My background is in education. I'm a former science teacher, worked in the nonprofit field for quite some time, did a little bit of policy work and fundraising work. And that sort of led me, similar to what David was sharing before, was I sort of wandered into the world of data and really leveraging information to inform decisions of policy, programs, and instructional practice. Within PCG, I oversee a swath of geography where all our services lie, and I'm also a member of the leadership team that sort of manages our state level data systems work. We were founded about 35 years ago in Boston, and we've grown quite a bit. I've been here for about a decade or so. And in that time, we've just exploded. We're in about 50 plus offices worldwide. And I know that we serve over, I think it's 70,000 schools across the country. So we're really excited to sort of bring this conversation to you. We've been learning a lot as we've been out there working with various clients. And we just wanted to share a couple of perspectives on that before we start to unpack the opportunity for ESSER. I'd also want to mention, the young lady just sort of swooped in there, Anna Edwards, who's one of the key principals at Whiteboard Advisors, who's a key partner in crime with us too, in terms of really making sense of really what's happening at the federal level and how that's translating into some action and some decisions at the state and district level that really indicate some promising practices. So I wanted to put a little bit of context first around some of these shifts that we're seeing within education. And for those of us who are PCG clients, you may have seen this before, but really as we start to think about, the evolution of special education over the last 20 to 30 years, it's really advanced significantly. I think originally there was this very heavy emphasis on paperwork and efficiency. And I think, in the last decade or so, we've been particularly mired in this area of compliance, really thinking about timelines as the key driver around whether or not you're doing the right thing within special education. I think, a variety of things have sort of, changed the perspectives on that. I think, the federal government, in terms of the emphasis on results-driven accountability, was, one sort of federal, stimulus piece that sort of prompted people to start thinking about outcomes for students. But then I think you also see this very, very strong voice around equity and opportunity and access that's really, even before the pandemic, starting to drive a lot of decisions and policy and investments. I think what we've been seeing across the country in the 39 states where we work, whether at the state level or at the local level, there has been this greater emphasis on student outcomes and growth, a greater emphasis on managing and measuring progress. And in many ways, that has required districts to really think about the IEP and how they structure and create that. And really thinking even from the basics of goals and objectives, like how are you really creating an ambitious, more thoughtful plan for students? And how are you setting it up in a way that's going to prepare them, for success after high school, whether it be in the workforce or going out to college. So we're really excited, to sort of see some of the language that's been out there around some of these federal investments, some of the focus that we're seeing in other places. But I think, David's going to give us a little bit of context now around ESSER and the emerging federal funding landscape. And I have a sense it'll be anchored, in some of the things that we were just highlighting there. Once David's done with that, we'll do a deep dive in some other areas, particularly focused on, those domains that you're necessarily, might want to think about in terms of these ESSER funds, in terms of how you're investing in things like leadership, human capital, systems, family engagement. But we'll talk a little bit more after that. So David, take the ball away, and we appreciate it.
And Anna, do you want to say a few words while I transition the screens?
Sure thing. Hi, everybody. Anna Edwards, co-founder of Whiteboard Advisors, and have done a lot of work over the years with Lauren and the team at Urban Collaborative. So thrilled to be here with Dave today to chime in a little bit with what we're hearing and seeing in terms of trends in state and districts as he walks through the policy and funding landscape. So thanks for inviting me to join. This will be fun, Dave.
Yeah, it should be now everyone, Jim, Anna can see the screen. Everything's presenting well. Good.
We're good.
We've overcome the technical challenges. If you make it for the first 2 minutes, we're golden. So what we want to do today, and Jim, you talked about like progress and thinking about outcomes, results-driven accountability, which if you're working in special education, you knew that was a theme that was there for a few years ago, kind of faded away, but it's going to come back in a pretty unique and positive way. Because I want to spend this time that we have together about half hour in talking about what we see happening with the stimulus dollars, the American Rescue Plan, HR 133, the ESSER Part 2, and tie that into the challenges and the opportunities and the reframing of effectiveness for special education. And you're going to see how those conversations dovetail into what's being requested of school officials now with the ARP. And so in our conversation today, we'll run through stimulus to date, ESSER allocations, uses, challenges, making sure we're up to speed on this. I think for the most part, everyone is squared away on where we stand on this, but I want to make sure we're level set. And then we're going to get into some challenges and really take a deeper dive into what we've experienced over the last year when it comes to special education's challenges and emerging strategies that I think are reframing the opportunities and connecting it back to broader conversations when it comes to the ESSER funds, the stimulus dollars, which, by the way, will also connect to annual appropriations, certainly around IDEA, but more broadly as we kind of rethink some of the basic terms, objectives, and methodologies of federal programs and the services that they are providing in a meaningful way to students and supporting the staff. So let's get up to speed on the stimulus. I think we're squared away on this. 3 big tranches: CARES Act, CRSA, terrible acronym. I call it HR 133, which is the identifying the bill number for the second stimulus and the second installment of the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, ESSER. And then the third recently passed, the ESSER 3, $13 billion, $54 billion, $122 billion, and they're getting towards $190 billion that is flowing. And as you know, 2 and 3 are in some ways coming in close sequence to each other, simply because of the way the law is drafted and some delays that have occurred at the state. Bottom line, it's a lot of money coming in a short period of time for a response to the pandemic in an economic environment that thankfully is not as bad as we thought was going to be a year ago. And that is really, I think, a beneficial situation, but also, and I say this like seriously, also it's going to put incredible scrutiny on how these funds are used and whether they're used to do something meaningful and different. I'll also add that there's a one-time $3 billion plus up to the federal fiscal year 21 appropriations included in the American Rescue Plan. That's a rider to the annual appropriations bill that was part of ESSER 2. And we know that the Biden administration is requesting the continuation of those dollars. Odds are, well, we'll see whether Congress follows suit, but likely we have a new watermark here for investments into special education. Key dates, again, as a refresher, few key aspects to know, and what this chart shows you, a lot happening here. So let's unpackage it a bit. On the bottom, we have the basic calendar years. On top of that, overlapping school years. The yellow here was the issue of great uncertainty, still is in some places, of what states will provide for their state investments in education for state fiscal year 22. Now, in many cases, that may be resolved. Doesn't mean we're out of the woods yet, right? Depends on what happens in the economy, what happens in state fiscal year 23, 24, 25, and beyond. But there is, again, relative to where we were a year ago, we're in a much better place. There are some outliers. Texas still sorting out a lot of issues. Florida, it's kind of a meh, but it's better than anticipated. It depends on enrollment. In other places, Iowa, Idaho, like much better. Oh my gosh, they're doing very well. And even places, I almost hate to say that publicly, but it's already happened, so it's safe, like New York, living up to some of its state allotment into K-12, which 6 months ago didn't seem feasible. Now, the good news is that typically school officials' districts operate 3 fiscal years at any one time. That's the blue here. And so normally there's a little bit of a guessing game on how much Congress will provide year to year. With this administration, given the focus on education and even redefining education for earlier into later, for pre-K into public, into free college and supported 2- and 4-year programs that are being proposed, what we see here is an investment, at least a stable investment in the annual appropriations. This includes the additional $3 billion into IDEA that's been layered onto the fiscal year 21 and proposed for federal fiscal year 22. Then come the 3 stimulus dollars, 13, 54, $122 billion. The drop lines here represent when the funds must be obligated, and that's when school officials must commit the dollars either by service or by contract. And that's the first tranche, September 30, 2022, the second, September 30, 2023, and the third, September 30, 2024. All include the additional 12 months tidings period that comes with education funding. But the short of this is, I think, two things. One, there is an exigent situation and responding to the pandemic and re-envisioning and creating and investing in innovative solutions to provide services that are special education by law as a civil right, but also adjusting to the new environment, the new post-pandemic or pre or kind of post or wherever we are pandemic, whatever that environment is, like being able to serve that different type of educational model. And there's a lot to unpack there. But there's enough funds to do that now and to plan for these funds and to be mindful that these funds were there not only to support it this summer, but into the next year, into the next school year, and into the next school beyond that. So it's both ability to respond to exigent circumstances and to invest the funds now.
Dave, one thing I just wanted to add on that last slide, I'm sure that there are a lot of folks that are listening in right now that are saying, I'm hearing about all of these new federal funds. I've heard some district friends call them the Biden funds, or ESSER dollars or stimulus dollars, but say, like, I haven't seen that in my day-to-day reality in serving students in my district yet. You know, where are they? And one note that's kind of buried up there in that top that we were really excited to see in the American Rescue Plan that's worth calling out is the no later than 60 days after the receipt of such funds that the state education agencies must release those dollars to districts. That clock started for about $81 billion of the funds on March the 25th, which means that by May 25th, you should be seeing funds and districts should be seeing funds. And then we have the next tranche, which $41 billion was just made available by the US Department of Ed. So Dave, sorry to skip ahead, but I think that 60 days is important because I know it can feel really frustrating in this moment, trying to prepare for compensatory services and summer school and not yet having seen those dollars that it looks like such big, you know, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, but not having felt them. And we're very hopeful, at least by law, that LEAs should receive you know, their portion of that $81 billion by the end of this month. And in some states, they might see the ESSER 2 and the ESSER 3 dollars hit it once, which will be, you know, a massive amount of funding. And we will definitely be sharing the slide deck because I know this is a lot to take in, but just wanted to call that out in case you're in one of those districts that's saying, hey, where are our dollars? And if you've been waiting on the state to release them, that first tranche of the 81 billion should be to you by the end of the month.
Yeah, and there's a this chart represents, and I should say 2021, the estimated allocation of the funds. So this is ballpark, right? So ESSER 1, ESSER 2, ESSER 3. Anna was talking about the $81 billion that's going out, and you know, Texas is a good illustration of this, where the governor put out a press release, kind of taking a victory lap on the release of funds because districts hadn't seen any ESSER 2 or 3. You know, slow that down a bit. I'm not sure about a victory lap. They had to do that. I appreciate the politics of taking credit for the distribution of funds that have not yet been felt for those Texas districts. But that's right. ESSER 3 is forcing state agencies to get moving on the distribution of funds. Now, some have been pretty quick about it and moving them out, at least opening up their grant award, their grant e-grant systems to allow districts to apply and be able to draw that down. And each state, depending upon where you are, will manage it a little bit differently. I know some states want it spent sequentially. Other states may make the grants available all at the same time. And so, you know, look for your particular state guidance and how they're sequencing that and some of the nuances of the application. But they're beginning to flow. And in a few key points to recognize and make sure we're all level set on the use of the funds is all the funds, whether that's be the CARES Act or ESSER 2 or ESSER 3, are distributed by Title I formula to districts in proportion to how many Title I dollars they get. The state may reserve up to 10%, not less than 10%, up to 10% for statewide activities. 90% has to go to districts. And for ARP, you'll see that 10% includes a really this emerging focus on educational opportunity and addressing, we'll use the term learning loss, but it's lost instructional time, or however that's however it's phrased. It's a umbrella topic that addresses the experience of the pandemic and those who've been disproportionately impacted academically and educationally by the pandemic. So of that 10%, not less than 5% goes to learning loss, not less than 1% for summer activities, not less than 1% for after school activities. And then one of that 90% that goes to districts, there's a responsibility of using not less than 20% of the funds for addressing learning loss. And we'll talk about what that means and the challenges, the opportunities of that term. But what we've seen from the CARES Act to HR 133 to ARP, and this will couple into what the Biden administration will be doing in future appropriations, is really beginning to put the emphasis and the scrutiny and the conversation around addressing the lost instructional time that speaks to issues of equity, educational opportunity, the meaningful interaction between educators, counselors, support services, and students and families. So those touch points are really what's important here. And you see, we talk about the periods of when that can happen: summer school, after school, in school, out of school, community, involving the parents. And a lot of this is an invitation to rethink about how we engage families, communities, and students in meaningful educational activities that advance and accelerate the learning of those students, and in particular, the students historically disadvantaged and where it's been manifested and clear through the pandemic and as a result of the pandemic. So a lot of these are not new conversations. You know that. You've been dealing with this. Everyone here has been dealing in education for decades, I'm sure. But it gives us some new opportunities. We have some resources on the amounts that's provided. So take a look at that link. If you don't know, we provide some general estimates. So that should be helpful. And again, these are, you likely know this, but these are based on the Title I allocations, which means when you break it down on a per pupil basis, it will vary from district to district. Part of that's a function of how many eligible students and how many Title I dollars a district gets. Part of it is also because Title I formula every year has some volatility to it. That's an issue for ESSER reauthorization, but it does affect kind of what are the dollar levels that each district will get. And if you're a superintendent or a federal program director working in the district and you're comparing notes with your peers, you'll see that there are some differences. And so that tends to be the reason why that difference exists. And the final background note that we want to address before getting into some of the challenges is about district discretion. This is important, particularly in the charter school community, where charters are part of a school district, and there's some advocacy there for the delivery of funds and services. But the district has discretion to distribute to the schools by means that it deems necessary. And so the stimulus bill doesn't define how the district distributes to its schools. It may typically do so according to the way it does Title I allocations, because that's easier. But there is discretion, so be aware of that. Now, I want to move into the conversation about where we are with ESSER uses, and then focus in on what's our experience with special education, what have we learned, what are the challenges, and how do we reframe that conversation. So again, on the use of funds, what we saw and what we've increasingly seeing is this emerging focus on addressing academic, educational opportunity, learning engagement, otherwise under the umbrella of learning loss. Under this ESSER 2, what we saw was first a new allowable use that included learning loss, and that addressed, exemplified, and illustrated through administering using high quality assessments, evidence-based activities, information and assistance to parents and families, kind of getting them engaged and tracking attendance and improving student engagement. Again, this theme of like meaningful interaction, the touch points between educator, counselor, and student begins to really emerge. And end of the ARP, also a new administration in charge at this point. The real focus emerges on that learning loss. And the rule now, as I mentioned, is that not less than 20% of activities under ESSER 3 has to go to addressing learning loss. And now we begin to see the themes that are dominating conversation in DC at the national level begin to emerge. Evidence-based intervention, summer learning, tutoring, enrichment, extended day, and making sure that this is addressing social emotional learning, in particular for disadvantaged students, and in particular for students with disabilities who have had a rough go of it over the last year, as we'll see. A few other technical notes here. I talk about the financial components to this, but here's why this is important. Yes, there's a maintenance of effort. State has to continue to invest its level. There's also a maintenance of equity. We see this focus on high need district, high poverty districts to ensure that those who are most disadvantaged get the disproportionate concentration of the work. And at the district level, this is new. So if you haven't seen this, dig into this, pay attention. Equity for high poverty schools. The district can't reduce its funding for any high poverty school by an amount that exceeds total funding for all students or by an FTE, full-time equivalency basis. So this is important because now we're looking at school level investments of state and local dollars that couples into what is under ESSA about expenditure transparency at the state and local level. And folks, if you don't see that as like a big equity opportunity, you're missing it. You guarantee a civil rights community, parent attorneys are looking at the investments being made with state and local dollars in coordination with stimulus dollars to ensure that those with the highest need, those high poverty schools are being served. And so this is a conversation, it feels weedy. It looks weedy because it's maintenance of effort, equity. What does this mean? It's new, but it connects to some really broad themes. And we're going to revisit that when we look at some of the themes from the Department of Education. Now, the challenges, we've talked about learning loss, but I do want to signal this. It's in the statute. It's not the most favored term. It's not the term that people want to discuss because there's many more underlying aspects to this that need to be addressed, but it's in the statute. In order to unlock the dollars, you need alignment of your activity to the intents and purposes of the law, and that begins with learning loss, but it certainly connects to what we see happening in disproportionately impacted students, both on the academic side, but also broadly. I say academic, and by that I mean math and reading, but the educational side, the touch points, the engagement, the counselors, social emotional learning, behavioral issues, all the aspects that I think you could probably pack into social emotional learning to understand that's what an educational journey is. That individual child development, that's part of growing, not just math and reading. It addresses that. And so when we think about what are the recoveries, here's some sampling, but it addresses many things. And if you're a school official in a situation of recognizing that you can now really have an opportunity to address the needs that maybe you couldn't quite fit into a federal program, it didn't quite work with Title I because that's not how you did things in the past, or with special education because it wasn't quite right within the category, those lines are blurring. And that's going to be a great opportunity, not only for future federal funds, but absolutely with ESSER funds. And ESSER funds are setting the table for what's going to be happening going forward. Now with that, that's all background, because now I want to get into some special education stuff. Because here we can take these broad issues of trying to be creative and rethinking the issues and reframing our problems into a different way to approach it, into a different thinking of addressing these issues, and targeted it on special education, because this has been a very difficult time and also an eye-opening time for the way we think about special education, how those dollars, and how, as Jim mentioned up front, it used to be about just compliance, but it's not that. And the Department of Education is basically yelling at you, yelling at us, saying it's not that. And I'll show you how that's happening. So let's first look at what did we learn over the last year. And the Government Accountability Office provided a good report that begins to unpackage it, both for ELs and students with disabilities. and identifying the challenges in the way that the mixed delivery and the mixed services that are necessary to fulfill an IEP have to be coordinated, which is more easily done, not easily, but more easily done in a traditional school-based setting. But now when you put this into a distance learning setting, or you incorporate in and out of school settings, it becomes more complicated. And what they've identified is like a wide range of challenging factors of providing services that are in part of the IEP that have to be directly in special education or general. But if you look at this range of chart here, these blue bubbles, these are related services that make up that education experience that are necessary to prepare the student to be in a position to learn so that they can be in a least restrictive environment, right? To be part of the common educational program. That's the goal. That's the least restrictive environment. But absent any one of these parts, it doesn't work. They all need to be there. And again, it's easier in a normal environment. So transportation, speech language pathology, interpreting services, psychological, physical, therapeutic recreation, social services, nurses. Depending upon the IEP, all these have to come together. And that's like an incredibly difficult thing to do. And it really began to blow up once we ran into the COVID environment. And with blinders of a compliance mindset, we found ourselves in a situation like this Seattle Times story out of Washington, where the Seattle Times was reporting, they got reports that it was being interpreted that there is an inability to provide services to students with disabilities because it violated the ADA, because you couldn't provide certain things equally through an online environment. And so consequently, they shut everything down. This happened in Massachusetts. This happened in Seattle, in Washington. This happened in Connecticut. So this really litigious fear of making sure that everything is equitable and everything can be accessed as kind of driven, I think, in part by the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the requirements therein, caused a chill in services, which you'll see was contradictory to the intent of IDEA. And again, coming back to the point about compliance trumping innovation and effective solutions, that was lost here. You look at Connecticut, and I bring this up because Miguel Cardona was driving Connecticut at this time. And he had to deal with diverse challenges and complaints coming from parents and advocacy organizations and parent attorneys that they're not providing the services necessary, and in both the identification of services and the adjustment of an IEP plan, which necessitates the coordination between parents, staff, and the student. That communication has to happen, and it has to happen in a meaningful and timely way. That was argued wasn't being done in time. And I get it. If you look at the quote from the Special Education Division Director, Brian, I'm not even going to attempt his last name. It says, like, we're doing everything we possibly can to work with districts to incorporate it and also be in compliance with the law. But what we saw, I think the big theme here is coming out of this quote from the special education attorney, is that we could have used this time to develop high quality remote learning to better serve kids with disabilities. And that didn't happen. Now it's beginning to happen in parts, but that conversation is still pretty seminal. It's still brewing. And again, I point this out because Miguel Cardona, he's on top of this. Now, whether he can get the agency and everyone on board to move in his direction, we'll see. But if you were fortunate enough to visit his homeroom session with Saul Khan, Cardona sat down, gave him the history of his experience in education as an EL, as someone who faced not only discrimination, but had to overcome learning issues. And he recognizes that where we are now, with not only the stimulus, but with the leadership and the opportunity to rethink accountability, to rethink compliance, this is a once in a generation moment. And that's not me saying it. That's the new Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, saying it, who dealt with this issue in Connecticut. So a lot of confusion, and a lot of it was driven by we were kind of orientated to the wrong objective. And that objective wrongly was simply compliance. Now, what have we seen?
And
the
Dave, I
Department
would
of
say it was
Yeah.
the wrong compliance objective, but probably for any folks on the line from districts, they would also say, and no resources, right? At
Yeah,
that time,
right.
like the CARES Act was barely enough to, purchase PPE and get testing and like think about those initial needs in spring of 2020. And like before all of the ramifications started taking place, and then we didn't get ESSER 2 and HR 133 until December of 2020. So I think that there's the issue with objectives and compliance and disincentives, but also there was just a lack of resources to innovate as well. And I think that's where this moment of hopefulness that we're, in addition to someone like Cardona being at the helm and prioritizing special education in the administration of these most recent stimulus packages is great. And then also that the funding's coming into place too.
And it's you look at some stories about what the funding that's available, and I've seen an article recently out of Kansas about like starved services in special education. And this will certainly come back to a conversation around what's the federal contribution, what percentage, how does that work out? Yeah, all true. A lot of it will ultimately have to come to a state conversation on the funds they provide. And local funds, because as you know, or most here know, special education is the primary responsibility of the local district. Excess costs are supported by the state, and the excess of the excess costs are supported by the federal government. And so the federal government is not going to provide the full solution, but they will provide a significant share of it and lead the conversation. What we kind of in response to some of this confusion, we saw a series of strongly worded letters, not only out of the Department of Education, but the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. And that is that there's a serious misunderstanding, and that educators have been reluctant to provide distance instruction to students with disabilities because they thought that disability law, ADA, was insurmountable. This is simply not true. And you're going to hear this again and again in a plea to find innovative new services and solutions. And the Office of Special Education Programs put out a Q&A document, kind of making it really clear that even in this environment, the responsibility is there to do so. And not only that, is a responsibility unchanged to ensure that you're serving the IEP, that you're providing a free and appropriate public education, but that everyone must continue to have the chance to meet challenging objectives, effectiveness, actual academic or educational or both progress. In that it is a responsibility of the IEP teams to think through how this will be provided in the new context and to rethink the delivery of programs that engages the community, that's intra-agency related, and that best serves the needs of the students. And so what I see here, and we know is coming out of the Department of Education, is a doubling down on the fiduciary responsibility to carry out this work, but to think differently about the way it's done. Like that's about as clear as it gets. Now I'm going to double down on that, triple down on this, whatever, quadruple down on this, because they can step back to the Supreme Court case, Andrew v. Douglas. In this case, this is a special education case that questioned, like, what's the standard of free and appropriate education? And the bar was raised. And so there is, even in particular, because of the COVID environment, we're dealing with a new bar to ensure that there is meaningful progress. That's not just doing the forms. It's not just compliance, because that's what this Douglas County School District was doing. But in fact, that they're making a meaningful difference as appropriate for the individual student. And that third bullet about IDA demanding educational programs are reasonably calculated to make appropriate progress, given the kid's circumstances. Like we can't do miracles here, I get it, but it has to be really meaningful. You can't just phone this in. And this is going to not only drive parent attorneys, but it's really going to focus on, is everything being done? Are all levers being pulled to ensure that the student is making meaningful progress, and in the least restrictive environment, part of the part of the ordinary educational program to the extent possible. And that's not going to be a simple compliance issue, but it's going to be about talking to community, engaging, having those conversations, which brings me back. to ESSER. In the Federal Register for ESSER 3, there is a interim final requirement about what districts have to do in preparation for the plans to get that final 1/3 of funds that have yet to be released. Anna talked about this up front. The first tranche has been released. The final third is contingent upon a state plan that is due in June in coordination with district plans that have to be submitted. Now, these are really meaningful because the districts have to engage in meaningful consultation with administrators, families, including special education administrators. I didn't just drop that in there. Like, this is in the rules pointed out that special education administrators have to be part of this, and that there has to be meaningful consultation with civil rights organizations to make sure that the interests of the children are represented. And so this process about like meaningful consultation and engagement is exactly what Andrews is talking about. It's exactly what's in the guidance of special education. It's exactly what the Office of Civil Rights laid out for us earlier in the year. And so the confusion that emerged in the beginning of the year about whether we should be more compliant or whether we have to focus on progress, effectiveness, and using the innovative technologies now available to us to make that happen, like, that's not just a nice to have. This is what has to happen.
Yeah, David, I think what we're seeing across the country is sort of there's that convergence of now having the time and the headspace as well as the dollars to really start to build into some of these considerations. I think we've got, just from our network within PCG, examples of clients who sort of stepped up and broke down those barriers to improve family communication, to think about how are they setting effective goals and monitoring progress. And I think there are good communities out there, similar like the Urban Collaborative, who are sort of sharing some of those best practices. But I almost feel, and this is me as a parent as well, I feel like I have a little more time. Like, I'm not reacting to the pandemic anymore. I've got enough space. There's enough routine. We're coming out of it. Where I think there's that other opportunity now where I think they're representative examples of this, the dollars and the opportunity of some trailblazers in some of these areas to really start to think about how do we do this effectively.
Yeah, the only thing that causes me some concern, there is enough time, but there's also a time crunch to think about these plans and begin to submit these plans. So if a district is barreling in compliance minded and getting a plan in without thinking about what does this mean for my compliance for Andrew, and what does this mean for me to rethink what I can do around teletherapy, to rethink what I can do about interagency communication, data analysis, analytics, you name it. Like, that's missing a huge opportunity. And so we have some time, but like the pen on paper, it begins now. Yeah. And thinking it through beforehand is going to be important. So some of the kind of thinking about the opportunity and the effective approaches that are emerging, we've seen multiple organizations trying to understand, like, what does FAPE look like in a time of COVID? And there's a few themes that emerge, like using data-driven decision, individualizing student and individualized student resources, and addressing family needs, interagency, interdisciplinary collaboration, evaluation of remote learning to make sure it's as effective as possible. And when we kind of break this down, on this slide, we have some strategies on the left and examples on the right of what that looks like. So part of this is understanding and being on top of the needs. So maintaining or increasing the frequency of data collection, getting families involved, like understanding their needs and their data collection and getting them engaged in the process of equity, of quality. Looking at barriers to access, like what's that opportunity to learn look like? How do we understand it? And making sure that everything is being documented. The path is clear, and all this information is easily accessible for those who have to navigate what's an opportunity, but also a difficult situation, and inevitably a little bit of like an audit nightmare if you don't do it right. So like, what does that look like? And we know, examples on the right here, thinking about like providing families with visually supported directions of collecting data, like rethinking how we engage families and students with disabilities, being really clear on the data collection schedule, documenting procedures during assessments, reviewing documentations for best practices. Like, all of this is, you can certainly work with CEC, Public Consulting Group, like pull together some of those best practices so we can better think about this as an education community on the best way to do this. When it comes like individualized student needs and family needs, like how do we identify the best method of communicating with parents, determining and addressing individual community barriers to remote instruction, like what's the tech, what's the infrastructure, and how are districts doing that, and addressing health and wellness needs. So again, examples on the right here, placing Wi-Fi in accessible community locations, using meal pickups as an opportunity to do some mental health screening, safety screening. So being kind of thoughtful about our touch points and not only digitally, but physically with parents and communities. And then thinking about interagency, interdisciplinary collaboration, let's like facilitating the costs and the Medicaid billing, and then identifying that whether it can be pulled out of a Medicaid program or paid by IDEA, that there's a coordination on allowable costs that's related to the IEP, instead of just being, again, compliance driven. And you see this in examples. North Carolina is making speech language teletherapy permanently reimbursable. They're coordinating what's happening with Medicaid and special education in the students' IEP and 504s. So how do we be more thoughtful about that? And, we can go through and understand like what is the ethical and valid evaluations and different ways to think about remote learning. Again, some good strategies here on the left, examples of what that looks like on the right. And most of this is about rethinking and reframing that conversation. So I want to connect it to one more thing and then open it up to some conversation and questions and answers. Like that's specifically to special education strategies and learning. Now let's look at broadly for ESSER 3 and broadly for ESSER generally, what are the issues the Department of Education will be looking at? And this is coming out of the COVID Handbook Volume 2. This is the guidance, kind of loose guidance on best practices, but they coordinate it into 3 buckets, which is addressing lost instructional time, safe and healthy learning, supporting educator and staff well-being. Now, this is what the Department of Education is going to want. Now, Anna, I can see you chomping at the bit to jump in here.
I put a link in the chat just so everybody has it. Someone had asked in the Q&A if the Department of Ed had put out any guidance that mentions how to use these funds to support students with special needs. So I did put the handbook in the chat.
And I think you can look at this conversation about effective approaches in special education. Let's translate it to learning loss, addressing resource inequity, supporting equitable access and effective use of technology, using data about student opportunity to learn. We just talked about this in special education. In many ways, like there's a convergence of the kind of stuff that needs to happen in special education for all students. Meeting social, emotional, and mental health needs of students, providing a safe and inclusive learning environment, supporting mental health. We just talked about that. I mean, these are the strategies for special education as well. And when it comes to some staff issues, like there's huge staffing issues, challenges in special education. I talked to my superintendent friends in Massachusetts, and they're, probably shouldn't say this, but like they're setting a low bar. They're like, man, if you're breathing and you're capable, I need you. If you're working special education, I just need help. I need qualified people. And the department is interested in training and providing services to ensure that there's a qualified and effective workforce. So too with special education, and ensuring that the diversity and the ability to connect with students is there. So too with special education. You'll see these are all very similar in what's being asked and what's being directed of by the Department of Education on the use of ESSER dollars in their relationship with the effective approaches and new approaches that we see coming out of the Department of Education. So my final note will be where it all comes together is thinking about the plan. And this Federal Register document that asks districts to do the collaborative planning, to think about how they are inclusive, engaging in meaningful consultation, particularly with students with disability, and related to the plan about strategies and use of the funds going forward. This is a great opportunity to take a pause and to as the Secretary Cardona mentioned, think about the once in generation opportunity to reframe the issues and to leverage what we've learned about the technology available to us to provide a different type of educational experience, both for the agencies, the staff, the students, the families, the parents, and the community. And that opportunity is before us. And we'll, the more we have conversations like this to bring awareness to it, and the more we touch with groups like CEC, NCLD, and other advocates of special education and civil rights to ensure that we're all moving in the right direction around effective, results-driven, and focused on progress for students with disabilities, and then like that's a better conversation. And I think we need to be mindful of that so we don't miss that opportunity.
So David, I'm just going to put up on my screen something real quick before we get into the Q&A, but I do think, you know, first that what you just presented is really helpful and relevant. I think not just for what I see as many of our district clients on the line, but a couple of colleagues as well. You know, I give some credit, I believe she's on the line, but my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Meller, who leads a lot of our special education consulting work, has been really conferring with our clients, with other leaders in the space, looking at the research. And there'll be a lot more coming in this area, but just to give a little bit of a teaser, you know, really thinking about how are we supporting and scaffolding that shift to effectiveness and really working with districts to help them really understand and make it more actionable about what are their specific domains that if we invest these dollars in a coordinated way, how are we going to shift the culture? How are we going to build the capacity to sort of make that pivot successfully from compliance to effectiveness? And really thinking about, you know, you were talking about human capital. I think we've got more ambitious goals than your friend, but, you know, really, how are we thinking about from the point of, you know, recruitment to actually investing in folks so that they can really be more versatile, more flexible in ways that they have to now, just given the needs of students. You know, make sure we're creating these cultures of high expectations and inserting rigor where sometimes it wasn't before. The whole piece is around systems and structures, around, you know, creating the culture and the capabilities for data collection, for engagement with families in meaningful ways, and really thinking about that connection more powerfully. And then really, you know, I think which is the hardest one of all of these things, the learning environment and the specialized services, and really making sure that we're doing our best to break down those barriers so that students feel like they're in an inclusive environment. They're not something different. And leadership's the hardest thing. And I think that's going to take recruitment, development, identification, so many things. But when you look at the allowable uses of the dollars, they fit all within here. And I think all it requires is creativity, models of effective like implementation, and some good thought to partnership. So, you know, with that, I really appreciate, you know, the information and insights that you offered today. To the folks who are on the line, you know, we'll certainly be pushing out a lot more information and actually some very concrete ideas in each of these domains of effectiveness over the next coming weeks and months. But I'd certainly want to, you know, pause for a few minutes so we could take some Q&A. And I'm sure I haven't poked in there to look what's in the Q&A feed. But I know my colleague Lauren's on the line too, who can sort of help sift out any questions that might be out there for us.
Thanks, Jim. We have one question, and I think you wanted to field this one, or if this was addressed by your link. About
no, I knew that we would be getting to it at the end with the U.S. Department of Ed guidance in direction that the Department of Ed was giving on use of the funds to support special education. You know, I think one of the things that we've seen is because the legislation was so broad, and it did include a specific emphasis in the area of learning loss and supporting students with special needs, you know, called out among English learners and students from low-income communities. But it probably is going to take some internal advocacy work, to be quite honest, in a lot of districts for special ed directors to go to, you know, the superintendent and the financial and legal teams and say, the law says that students with special needs are covered in this legislation, and this funding, you know, for a specific project we're thinking about for modernization or data collection or providing teletherapy absolutely are covered, you know, within the legal parameters of all three stimulus packages. So because the legislation was so broad, we know that special ed expenditures count, but it could take a little bit of work because I don't think there's been really explicit guidance around special education, Dave, that I've seen. I think all of it's been embedded in these broader handbooks, like the one that I posted in the chat.
Yeah, and we'll be getting over the next few weeks additional guidance coming out of the Department of Education on, anything ranging from what's their best interpretation of the evidence requirements within ESSER, probably pretty loose, to some additional guidance, I'm certain, on special education, given the importance of the issue.
Great. We had another question come in that asked if you could speak to ESSER's non-categorical aspects, unlike Title I or IDEA, that in an unprecedented federal way truly enables special education departments to work with those from other departments and collaborate in a way that has not been previously available to support students with disabilities, like MTSS and effective inclusive instruction.
I think the response here is the ability to do that. So there is an encouragement by the law to do this intra-agency work, to understand like what are the cross-cutting strategies that can facilitate the data use and the aggregation of that data for identification of needs and more. So it's not going to be delineated, and I wouldn't look for anything that's a clear delineation in the law. What you'll find is under the ESSER funds, there'll be themes and illustrations of best practices. And the secretary will certainly be advocating for creative and innovative use of these funds that end up a year from now doing something differently than what you're doing now. I think the worst case scenario would be nearly $190 billion later, nothing is changing. Like that's a nightmare for the secretary. That's a nightmare for this department. And they'll be advocating to ensure that even without an explicit categorical, that the efforts are made by leaders and individuals who have a different vision and want to see special education and their agencies in a different place in a year.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So Jim, if you want to wrap us up.
Yeah, sure. So there will be a lot more information coming out. For those of you who wanted to get your hands on the slide deck, we'll get you that, and we'll also get you a recording of this presentation. If you have any subsequent questions, you can reach out to us. However you heard about this, reach out to the colleague at PCG. We'll be certainly happy to help you. I'd love everyone to sort of join me in thanking David, Anna, and the team at Whiteboard Advisors. Just tremendous vessels of knowledge and good perspectives. And it's been really great, across our network of clients and the services that we're doing across the country to sort of mesh together the policy, the politics, and the realities of what's happening on the ground in ways that are helping schools do things better by kids who need it. And our friends at the Urban Collaborative, thanks again, for helping convene this conversation. We look forward to the ongoing dialogue. And, for those of you who we do serve on a daily basis, we're happy to lean into this conversation and help you out in the months and weeks ahead. So, with that, I think we can wrap things up. I think we're actually 2 minutes early, which is a miracle in and of itself. So, for everybody, please be safe, continue to do well. And, as you wrap up the school year, we wish you the best of luck. And thanks again for joining us. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.